Good morning, Nachum. Good Erev Shabbos, everybody. I'd like to begin with something different that I've never done before, and that is as follows. We've developed a style that I'm privileged to start every week's Dvar Torah with the words, tomorrow we have the privilege. I don't know where and how Hashem put those words in my mouth, but I'm so grateful because at least I know how to start each week. And the truth of the matter is, each week is just that, another privilege. And then, depending upon the week, I usually tell how many mitzvos there are in that particular week's parsha. Well, given that in the book of Bereshis there are only 3 mitzvos, according to the Chinuch, and we had one in last week's parsha of Pru, none in this week's parsha, and Mitzvah Hashem next week, Mila, and then in Vayishlach, Gid Hanoshem. I do want to announce that in this week's parsha of Noach, we do have the Zion mitzvos b'nei Noach, the 7 Noachide laws that were given to all of mankind, as found in the beginning of chapter 9 of Parshas Noach, and they are the prohibition against idolatry, 1, to, in quotation marks, bless the divine name, meaning Lo Aleinu, the opposite. Number 3, prohibition of murder. Number 4, Gilui Arayos, immorality, sexual transgressions. Number 5, theft and civil laws. 6, dinim, they are to establish law courts. And finally, Aver min hachai, eating a limb torn from a live animal. Now, I'd like to talk about Noach. After all, that is the parsha, yet he is a most controversial figure. What does that mean? And not everybody has a song named after him. And the song actually comes from the very first verse in the parsha, where the Torah says, Noach ish tzaddik. And I was never the chazan in Shomrei Torah, only the rabbi, so I'm not going to sing it for you, but you've heard this at many smachot. Noach was a great tzaddik. Okay, so no question about it. The Torah says so. You can't argue with that. But as everybody knows, that it's on the very first pasuk that Tomimaya B'doro Sav, when the Torah is lauding and complimenting Noach, it says that he was Tomim, he was literally pure, perfect in his generation. And whether it's generations or generation, the idea is very clearly that Rashi brings the 2 opinions, which everybody knows. Yesh mei Rabboseinu, there are those of our rabbis who saw this as a great compliment, that if he was in a society of evildoers, and still look how great he was, had he lived in the days of Abraham and other righteous persons, he would have been even greater. And then, interestingly, they're introduced as V'yesh, and there are others, now without going into that Rashi forgot to write Rabosenu, maybe he didn't forget. Others that understand this lignai as to his detriment, only in accordance with his generation would he have been and was considered a tzaddik. But if he lived in Avram's day, he would not have been klum, anything especially noteworthy. Be that as it may, it already sheds some light on something about Noach, and as much as we're praising him, and the Torah does, there is something that is there, that imperfection. And what I'd like to start with is, very interestingly, a comment of the last pasuk. But before I do that, and lest I get too involved in a delicious Kedushas Levi, which I'll introduce in a moment, let me just say 2 words of introduction regarding the Parsha. Number 1 is that what happens in this second Parsha of Noach to Avram, the second 1,000 years of civilization, the Torah highlights 2 different era. The era Dor HaMabul, of the flood, who, because Atimoleo Oretz Chamas, the world was full of violence, and not coincidental, the name of Nebach, those that come out of the tunnels to fight us in Gaza. But let's stick to the point that this generation had to be, as God says at the end of Bereshis, Emche, like they used to have a blackboard and an eraser wiped off, and you couldn't see what was there before. This generation had to be killed out, except for Noach, his wife, his 3 sons and sons-in-law, daughters-in-law, so 8 people. And then the end of the Parsha, we have the Dor HaFlaga, the generation of the flood, that wanted to build the tower to literally fight God. And that's the Dor HaFlaga, which means the generation that was dispersed. And hence 70 nations, 70 languages. All this is condensed, but just one very important observation, and that is the Drushos Horan. Why is it that the first generation of the flood had to be annihilated and the second generation was dispersed? And the Ran says something very powerful. He says there's a difference between a flaw, F-L-A-W, a deficiency, a sin of midos. Midos is character, and or a sin of deos, which is knowledge. What does that mean? It means that character is passed down into and by the DNA, and as a result, the generation and everybody had to be wiped out, because the next generation would also have been Hamas, terrible. They had to be wiped out. As opposed to, at the end of the Parsha, interestingly, they were kind man to man. They wanted just to, quote unquote, uproot God. They were completely mistaken, misinformed with their knowledge. This people can be taught, and therefore Avraham comes on the scene at the end of the Parsha, and the rest, as they say, is history. That's one very important point. And the second point I always try to share is the Ramban, that the Torah is telling us God's humility. What does that mean? The Torah tells us how large the ark was. And by the way, it was shlosh me'os amor orech, 300 feet long. I'm sorry, 300 amos. That's 450 feet long. Could you imagine? That's rather big. So one could see maybe all the animals could fit on. Says the Ramban, keep this in mind everybody, that 10 arks could not satisfy all the animals, the people, the food for a year. And even think how many birds, just the birds alone, in this world. So therefore, Hashem always tries to hide, to make light of his miracles, to always give man the opportunity to have free will. Is there God or not? Okay, now let's get down to business. I want to share with you what I consider a delicious Kedushas Levi, as found in the last pasuk in Bereshis, which will give us further insight into Noach and his character. So the pasuk reads, "V'Noach motzah chen b'nei Hashem." After telling us at the end of Bereshis of the deterioration of the generation, the Torah tells us, one good thing at the end, that Noach found chen in the eyes of God. In the eyes of God. Now, what does the word chen mean? So, Art Scroll and many others in the English translation use the word grace. I'm going to tell you that chen is a difficult word to translate. So, for example, you ask me about a particular young lady for a shidduch. I say, I know one thing about her. She's got a lot of chen. I think you can understand what I'm communicating without translating the word chen. Now, what does it mean here? So, I want to tell you that the Kedushas Levi shares with us, as do many of the commentaries, both early and later, that there are two different kinds of tzaddikim. One who is close with God, le'atzmo, for himself, what they call a tzaddik in pelts, meaning if it's cold outside, two ways to either keep warm, putting on a winter coat, a pelts, or by creating a fire. You put on the coat, you're going to be kept warm, but just you. You create a fire, you can keep others warm as well. So Noach was the one who was righteous by himself, but did not share the wealth, in contrast to Avraham, where the Torah says, "Es hanefesh asher asu b'choran." In the beginning of next week's Parsha, the souls that they had made. How do you make a soul? The answer is Avraham, the men, Sarah converted, quote, the women, meaning elevated them. They shared their spiritual wealth as Noach did not. In fact, Kedushas Levi brings from the Arizal and others that Noach needed Gilgul Moshe, the idea of transmigration of the soul, that after the soul leaves this world, it goes to another. So the soul of Noach needed tikkun, fixing, by Moshe Rabbeinu, because whereas Noach kept to himself, Moshe, says the Kedushas Levi, Hoyomochiach Tomid Kol Yisrael. He would rebuke Israel all the time. Good. Now let's go further. Says the Kedushas Levi something which I find to be fantastic. We've read this pasuk 100 times, but he finds something that I never saw before. And that is, the Torah says, Noach motzo chen b'nei Hashem. Noach, in distinction to his generation, he found favor in the eyes of God. Now, what does that mean to you, to find favor? Is he active or is he passive? I always understood that to mean that he was, by his actions, he was, quote, passively having found favor in the eyes of God, meaning that God looked at him, in a quote-unquote special way. The Kedushas Levi brings the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Nun Zayin Amar Aleph 57a, teaching us that the people of Noach's time were Shtufei Zima, immersed in immorality. In contrast, Noach was Tzaddik Tamim. Now here goes. Says the Kedushas Levi that Noach used this relationship for holiness, the relationship that he had with his spouse, within his family, the Kedusha, for holiness, as opposed to the Dor Harmabel, the generation of the flood, that was immoral. They had this, quote, relationship of affection, leklipa, for negativity. It was just immediate. It was transient. It wasn't permanent. And further, v'Noach lo hoya mochiach osam. Noach did not rebuke them. And this is how he learns Pshat in the Pasuk. Noach motzah chen b'nei Hashem. What does it mean, Noach motzah chen? He found. In other words, he was active. He found something. Ratzah lomar ra'ah sheyesh mitzius chen ba'olam hazeh. There's a chefza. There's an object. There is a quality that you can actually touch metaphysically in this world called chen. And this he elevated the Kedusha, but he only shared it b'nei Hashem with Hashem, but not with the rest of his contemporaries. I believe the very powerful lesson is, just like we're all familiar with that song, Noach was a great tzaddik, we should also be familiar with that song, Geschmack zu sein a Yid. Once again, very hard to translate the word chen, very hard to translate the word Geschmack, but I'll tell you what it does mean. Be proud to be a Jew. And this pride, we have to look deeper into ourselves and what's going on in Eretz Yisrael today, the great divisiveness, just as all of us welcomed the coming home of the hostages on Hoshana Rabbah. What a great gift on that very special day. So too, and we were all together, all, A-L-L, in welcoming them home. We must find a way that all of Klal Yisrael can get together to fully bring an end to this war. Shabbat Shalom to all.